You are listening to the FORSCOM Frontline, bringing you to our soldiers on the front lines of readiness.
Welcome to the FORSCOM Frontline. I'm Dean and I'll be your host today. June has a lot of history for the armed forces to include D-Day, FORSCOM's 50th anniversary, and the Army's birthday. We thought we'd share some history for everyone out there that might not know the significance in all three of these events. So we brought in the FORSCOM historian, Jeffrey Miller, to bring a voice to the history books. That's Jeff right there. How you doing, Jeff?
Hello.
So thanks for joining us, Jeff. As we said, before we launch into the past, can you tell us what the role of a command historian is?
To be brief, the role of the command historian is to capture the history of the command. We maintain the historical records of the command, and we make sure all our downtrace units also are turning in history reports and trying to capture their history as well. We ensure that the FORSCOM commanders do an exit interview at the end of their tour, so we get their command perspective, and the headquarters staff itself annually, submits historical reports to the office that we compile to capture our history.
So that sounds pretty important. I mean, off topic. What's the importance of turning in this stuff every year then? I mean, for people that might not understand, you're able to go back over all these wars and look at stuff.
Well, basically, if the units are not being proactive, if the Army is not proactive in capturing its own history, then that history will be lost because no one's going to do it for them. So across the Army, major efforts are put in place to make sure in this digital age we capture and maintain our records. The Center of Military History, has a large digital files record, and we support their efforts as well in capturing the history. We maintain the Army's only two active component military history detachments, and we send them out. They're both deployed right now. The 44th History Detachment is in Wiesbaden, Germany, supporting the support group in Ukraine. The 7th History Detachment's in Qatar, supporting CENTCOM. So we maintain a constant rotation forward to capture the Army's history.
So it's interesting you say that. It's almost like we set this up. I'm kidding. I was in Wiesbaden a couple of years ago for Defender 21, still currently in the reserves, and I was also in a military history detachment. I think it was the 45th in Aiken, South Carolina, a few years ago.
Yeah, most of the history detachments are in the Reserve or National Guard components, and they train regularly, and we try and integrate them with our active component corps and their warfighter exercises prior to their deployments as well.
Cool. Are you ready to get going here?
I'm ready.
All right. So who took place during D-Day from a FORSCOM unit perspective, and what was the significance?
During World War II, FORSCOM, or its equivalent, was known as Army Ground Forces. So Army Ground Forces, they had the same patch, but they had a much broader mission than FORSCOM has today. Essentially, they also were responsible for training and doctrine and the equipping of the force. General Leslie McNair was its commander for most of this period. So decisions had to be made for force structure and sustainment and all these key decisions years ahead of time. So before D-Day, major decisions were being made by around 1940, 41 on how that Army would look like and how it would prepare and train for this major operation. So one of the things the Army did is the Army began major conscription early before entering the war. So we were building up the size of the Army, and we organized major field exercises, large-scale training exercises in the continental United States. And so I would recommend for our interested readers The Rise of the GI Army by Paul Dixon, which is a great description of these early years of the Army's training. And this was important because it trained the staff officers in particular. They actually got hands-on experience moving trucks and logistics. And so the staff officers were well prepared to conduct operational maneuvers when the war came. Now, at the time, the Army was looking at what happened in Europe in 1940 and the fall of France. And prior to the fall of France, the Army's strategic assumptions were that the French Army would be the shield of the West, and they could carry the heavy load of any aggression from Nazi Germany. So when France fell, it caused a major reassessment and almost panic in strategic circles in Washington. This book by Michael Nieberg, When France Fell, captures this period very well. And for example, and it influenced our force structure decisions. For example, watching the French Army panic under German dive bomber Stuka attacks led to a massive emphasis on anti-aircraft defenses and motorized anti-aircraft defenses, and led to some strategic decisions. We didn't anticipate that we would gain air superiority by D-Day over the Luftwaffe. And so therefore these units were in some ways superfluous to the ongoing operations. So some mistakes were made. The Army, during its training and preparation, had an inadequate air support doctrine. But during the war, we trained and adopted the British doctrine from our allies, and that was a much more effective. They had honed their doctrine in the Desert War years prior to D-Day, and when we landed in North Africa in late 1942, we quickly learned the benefits of their doctrine. However, we had a superior artillery doctrine. Artillery, we were able to equip a large amount of our force with radios, and so our time on target artillery tactics would prove devastating against the Germans in Normandy. And so, the strategic decision was also made to limit and cap the size of the Army to 90 divisions. And so, we were going to get maximum bang for the buck for our force.
Right.
So when you start getting into the gritty, boring details of force structure, I would recommend this book, Clash of Arms, How the Allies Won in Normandy by Russell Hart, that has a great chapter on Army force structure and decisions. And one of the decisions they made was a pooling structure, like that at the core level. So you would have anti-aircraft battalions, engineer battalions, and the like, and you could assign them to divisions as the tactical and operational situation dictates. Now, this was an assumption. In practical reality, once the war was ongoing, we quickly learned that units tended to stay with the divisions where they were assigned. It took time to train, for example, an anti-tank gun battalion and integrate it with its fellow infantry and armor battalions, and likewise. So they tended to keep them with the units where. So this was an example of where the assumption met tactical reality and had to adjust under fire.
So what was the importance of the Normandy landings then, June 6, 1944?
So essentially, if we hadn't landed in Europe, Europe to this day would have been dominated by either the Third Reich or Soviet Russia. By coming into Europe, we were able to liberate Europe and tie it into a long-term strategic, plan for economic reconstruction and political rebirth and renewal. So the Normandy invasion got the number of forces necessary into Europe. We were currently fighting in Italy, but Italy had certain logistical and geographical constraints in terms of the terrain. So it was very difficult to break out into Central Europe from Italy, although we were attempting that. We had limited shipping and logistics availability, and so Normandy was the ideal location in terms of risk versus reward. So, like the Army today, you see the think tanks practicing Taiwan invasion scenarios, and you read about this in the Rand Corporation simulating this. When you go through simulations of the Normandy landings, and here's an example of a recent commercial simulation, the Dark Summer Normandy by GMT Games, you find that the Allies invariably succeed in the landing and are able to make a foothold in Normandy. In fact, the German commander Erwin Rommel, in his planning for the defense, advocated putting the German armor forces, the panzer forces, right up in the beachhead. And he felt only if we deploy them all at the beach line itself, do we have a chance of resisting the Allied and knocking them off the beaches. But instead, the strategic decision was made to keep the German armored reserves further back in reserve. And so by the time they were deployed forward to Normandy, the Allies had a preponderance of forces landed. And so then it became a war of attrition. And here the Allies had an advantage. So I would recommend this illustrated book on the Mortain counterattack in 1944 by Steven Zaloga. This illustrates the disadvantages the Germans had fighting in the open in the face of Allied artillery and air power. And so the German army was just a smashed wreckage by the end of the summer after a long battle of attrition. And so then the Allies were faced with the operational task of going across Europe and to Europe. And here again, you can see some of the decisions made by Army ground forces, affected in that the Army did not have enough truck companies assigned to support a major operational advance across France. And so this limited the offensive. And a good book that covers all the logistics of this advance is The Battle for Western Europe, Fall 1944, an operational assessment by John A. Adams. And this book goes into depth the logistical hurdles that the U.S. Army faced and the strategic decisions that resulted. And this affected German strategic decisions as well, as they realized they had a moment in time where they could counterattack and delay the Allies far enough and maybe buy time for them to face off against the Russian army in the east, which was grinding away at them. And so, this lack of logistics, preparation, and support opened a window for a German strategic counterattack in the winter of 44. And this is a great book by British historian Anthony Tucker-Jones that was just published called Hitler's Winter, that lays out the German strategies of trying to, basically the logistics basis of trying to recapture the ports, the major logistics ports. So in other words, the Allies had so few truck companies to support their advance, they were relying on the ports closer to Germany, such as Antwerp, which and so that reduced the amount of time, the space for the truck companies to support advance. So the Germans planned an operational thrust to take the port, and that would have slowed down the Allied logistics train. Because you got to remember, France was totally destroyed, the rail lines and everything else. Now the Allies, the amazing economic capacity, we were building fuel pipelines across France, and we were building rail lines. But all this would come into play later and by the spring. So by the spring of 1945, after the Germans had expended themselves in the counterattack, you could see, once the logistics hurdles were overcome, the full operational capacity of the U.S. Army. And this is where this training and staff work going back to 1940 and 41 came into play. And this book, on Patton's crossing of the Rhine, Nierstein and Oppenheim, 1945, by Russ Rogers. Russ Rogers is a former FORSCOM historian, and he wrote this in his retirement. And it captures the amazing operational capacity of the U.S. Army in the late stages of the war, where the Germans were simply unable to counter the initiative and this advanced logistics and capacity and staff work gave them.
Yeah. So you mentioned about the training. So what kind of training was being done back then to prepare units for a war?
Well, the units, most of our bases and facilities that you see today were constructed either during World War One in the preparations or in the preparations for World War Two. So there was a vast logistics network. The entire economy was shifted, and industrial capacity was shifted to support this endeavor. And in fact, by the end of the war, forces were being already demobilized. The infantry, the veteran units that had led the assault into Germany were being demobilized and being sent back and being replaced by fresh divisions. And the focus was already shifting to Japan and making sure enough troops were available for the pending invasion of the Japanese islands. I would also recommend this book, War and Peace. It's a part of a trilogy by Nigel Hamilton that kind of dictates the overall leadership of Franklin Roosevelt and FDR toward this endeavor. His leadership and vision of how the post-war world should look and shaped, down to the level of what the Army's decisions were and what they were deciding in terms of, where the Army would go, how they which it was FDR's decision to invade Normandy, when and where. General Marshall, Secretary of War Stimson, these officers and leaders advocated an early invasion of Europe in 1942, 43. And in retrospect, this would have been very problematic and dangerous. And so, in a way, FDR's instinct proved superior to his military advice in this case.
Nice. I think we already talked about it, but why was Normandy so important in history?
Well, Normandy opened up, allowed us to recapture and penetrate into Germany and basically seize. But at the war's end, both sides largely froze in place. By both sides, I mean the Russian armies coming from the east and the Allied armies coming from the west and the south. And so by physically getting into Germany, you're basically securing that area for the West. And then it opened the door for the political Potsdam conferences, post-war, to kind of work out and delineate the post-war management of Germany as a prostrate nation and how it was going to be rebuilt. And in fact, our building, the FORSCOM headquarters, is named after George Marshall, who was instrumental in implementing a post-war plan for reconstruction in Europe, known as the Marshall Plan.
Nice. All right. I'm thinking here. Okay, so I'm not going to touch on the anniversary now.
Yeah, that's fine.
So what is the significance of the 50th anniversary of FORSCOM, and what was it like during its inception?
So its inception, FORSCOM's birthday is officially 1 July 1973. And as I mentioned earlier, prior to its birth, FORSCOM was considered Continental Army Command. So it was a huge edifice, and it had responsibility for doctrine, training, operations. And in 1973, it was broken up in stovepipe. So that's where you had Training and Doctrine Command and U.S. Army Forces Command split up. Now, the Army was in ruins at this point in time. So I would recommend this book, America's Army, Making the All-Volunteer Force by Beth Bailey, that covers the Army in this period in the early 70s. And her also book, An Army Afire, How the Army Confronted Racial Crisis in the Vietnam Era. So the Army was beset with racial problems, drug problems, and morale problems, and it needed a vision for the future. So it needed to be rebuilt. The Army did away with the draft, implemented the all-volunteer force, and so now it needed to be remissioned and repurposed after Vietnam. Its first commander was General Walter Kerwin, who served as General Westmoreland's chief of staff in Vietnam. He's probably unique in being one of the only Army generals to be told in the middle of a battle to prepare operational plans for implementing nuclear weapons. During the Tet Offensive, as Khe Sanh was under threat, he was told to draft counter plans for the use of tactical nuclear weapons in case that outpost was under attack. So he had a unique place in history. And he and General Depew, who commanded the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam, he became the first commander of Training and Doctrine Command. And your Army at this time was also under uncertain leadership, as the Army Chief of Staff, Crichton Abrams, was on his deathbed, dying of cancer. And so he was unable to make these critical decisions and was in fact hesitant to authorize this split of Continental Army Command. So it was authorized by the Vice Chief, and this became Operation Steadfast, and it split trade. But it was because of the nature and how it was implemented, sort of backdoored. It was done quickly, and so this led to the FORSCOM and TRADOC staff officers for the next 10 years ironing out MOI, memorandums of agreement, to try and iron out all the rough patches of who controlled what in the years to follow. And so in the years to follow, the Army repurposed itself with new equipment, new doctrine, and this is where you've got the M1 tank, the Apache helicopter, the Bradley fighting vehicle, and doctrine and the doctrine to go with it, focused on Europe and repurposing the Europe mission. And it gave the Army, and by the 80s and the 90s, you got to see the results of that Army when it was deployed into Kuwait. You got to see the results of this hard work of these officers and generals. So today, now at its 50th anniversary, FORSCOM has a little less authority than it had in 1973. We built up our North to take some of the operational responsibilities away from FORSCOM. FORSCOM has contributed a lot of slots in standing up Army Futures Command, and that's taken a little bit from TRADOC and FORSCOM. And so now the Army at its 50th birthday is going through a whole period very similar to 1973. So a lot of historians are looking back at the 70s as we plan the the remodernization of the Army, which is tying in Army, HRC, Human Resources Command, Army Material Command, Army Futures Command, TRADOC, and FORSCOM as we equip and prepare our Army for future wars. And so so this puts a lot of pressure on the Department of the Army to coordinate and orchestrate this future. As in a way, the Army has been structured to operate in almost a CEO collegiality, sort of, stovepiped, but all tying in to synergize through the Department of the Army. So this is an interesting, attending, Army synchronization conferences, you get to see the sausage being made as this Army moves step by step. And FORSCOM has to tie this into their training centers and all their training exercises, and to be able to align the units that are going through modernization with the need to have the Army ready to go and trained and manned and ready to fight our future wars.
So we mentioned D-Day. We mentioned the 50th anniversary of FORSCOM. We still got the birthday.
The 248th birthday, and FORSCOM usually has a nice event in our atrium and a birthday cake. Usually PAO lets us know what the logo is going to be. But to go back, 248 years to 1775, this was a point where the country was breaking away from Britain at the start of the Revolutionary War. I would recommend the book 1775, A Good Year for Revolution by Keith Phillips, that breaks down this period in depth. And as a historian, I always go back to lineages, and the army that gathered to fight in June of 1775 had a long lineage that went back many years before that. The New England colonists had to fight, apocalyptic wars against the Indians. So, these same militia units that fought at Lexington and Concord could trace their lineage back to King Philip's War. So I'd recommend Flintlock and Tomahawk, an old classic by Douglas Leach that covers the King Philip's War. And as European wars broke out, these wars would trickle over to the colonies. So French and English colonists would clash. So in the late 17th century, you had King William's War, which was in Europe the 9 Years' War. This was a big general war across Europe with France and Dutch and the Americans. And so, you can read about the American colonies and Americans were fighting under British command across the globe, down in the Caribbean, up in Canada, and out in the western wilds. And so, the American Army's history goes way back, and so it's a history to be proud of and to be justly celebrated.
All right, well, we're running out of time. We talk about some quick pieces of history, either the birthday, D-Day, anniversary. You think there's anything we missed? Or you think we got most of it?
Well, the Army history is in real time. So right now, the Army has a large contingent in Poland, that's training with the Polish Army, helping Ukrainian units prepare for battle. And so, the Army's got real missions, and the call could come at any time, and, we have the Army in the Pacific is also, we've had recent crises and wharf crises under our previous president, in North Korea, and, where the Army in Korea had to be ready to go. And so, the missions haven't changed, and the mission of FORSCOM to have the Army ready to handle the changing battlefield remains the same.
Okay. Well, hope that this brief history will give our listeners a better perspective that you can't read in books, even though you've recommended some. Thanks, Jeff, for taking the time to speak with us today. I hope that we can do more historical perspectives in the future, and I hope that covered a little bit of everything for everybody out there.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.